to the spiritual gift that he has received that we see in verse 14. Now, as I was going back over this, I realized that I probably left something that you might have a question about. And Dr. Greger has already accused me of skipping the hard stuff, which I don't know how, but I feel like I've gotten all the hard stuff. And so I thought, well, this will be one he catches me on if we don't cover it. So I feel like this is worth talking about just because of the possible implications if we don't have an answer to it and it's left unaddressed. So it's in verse 14. It says, "Do not neglect the spiritual gift within you, which was bestowed on you through prophetic utterance with the laying on of hands by the presbytery." Now this is chapter 4, verse 14. We're just going back to make sure that we've got this down before we jump into chapter 15. Now I was short on time last week, and I said, I really don't know too much about this. I don't have too many notes. Here's a couple of things I know, and we moved on. And that was shortchanging the text a little bit, so I wanted to go back. Because I think there's a fair question of, did the presbytery, the elders, were they the ones that passed the spiritual gift to Timothy? Because upon first reading, it kind of reads like that, right? And so, if so, what does that mean in regard to how spiritual gifts are passed? And so it's something that's worth covering, because I think it's a pretty fair question. So there's a few things to cover here. So I'll put them on the screen for you. The word "through" is this preposition that it could mean like by the means of, like by the means, let's see. The elder, the presbytery laid their hands and prophesied, and by those means the gift was passed. And so it could mean something like that, but it could also mean something more general, as though like the prophecy was accompanying, it was an accompanying feature. So it was like they were also prophesying. It's kind of the idea, which I think is probably more fair, especially knowing what we know about how gifts are passed in other parts of the Bible and how prophecy is never like a direct way that gifts are passed. So then we have also with the laying on of hands. And so this preposition, the with there, it's kind of used similarly. And so it's kind of saying they both were just done together. And what does this part of the verse mean? Well, and here's the crux of the issue here. Either it means that the elders conveyed the spiritual gift or they acknowledged it. And so what do we know that can help us figure out this answer? Well, in Acts chapter 8, verses 14 through 17, we see that the Christians in Samaria did not have the Spirit, and so two of the apostles had to leave Jerusalem to go to Samaria so that they could lay their hands on the Christians there and they could receive gifts. And in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, and this is a really helpful verse for us, I think, Paul says that he is the one, and it is by his hands that the gift was passed to Timothy. And so now we've got the question of, okay, well, if Paul passed the gift to Timothy, man, we're 4 minutes in this morning and starting off hot. If Paul passed the gift to Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, then how did the elders pass the gift? Like, what does this mean here in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 14? So there's a couple of possible solutions. One is that Paul was present for the event, like when the elders were, what we have here, verse 14, bestowing the gift through prophetic utterances with the laying on of hands, that Paul was present for the event where the presbytery did that, and that Paul also laid his hands on Timothy with them. You know, maybe it was like part of his departure in Acts chapter 20, verse 1. As they were departing, Paul laid his hands on Timothy with all of the elders, and it is through Paul that Timothy received the gift. We get this kind of laying on of hands in Deuteronomy 34, verse 9. But I think a better option, and I just think this makes the most sense, is that the events were separate. So I think Paul laid his hands on Timothy, maybe before leaving him, so that he could have the spiritual gift, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6. And then the presbytery, the elders, acknowledged the apostolic authority of Timothy from Paul by publicly prophesying and laying on of hands. Almost like this is our recognition that you have the gift that Paul has bestowed on you, and you're going to work here and help us as a whole, as a church here. Now, and we get an example of that kind of laying on of hands in Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 through 23, where, if I remember correctly, Moses lays his hands on Joshua in front of everybody so that everyone knows this is going to be the guy from here on out. So regardless, we leave off with Paul emphasizing to Timothy the importance of him continuing in his ministry, fulfilling his mission, and working with the church. And that leads us into chapter 5. I just wanted to be sure that we covered that, and that was clear enough. So in verses 1 and 2, he continues on with this instruction. He says, do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. So Paul ensures that though Timothy is not to be looked down on because of his youth, he is still careful not to sharply rebuke, which is a phrase that's only used here in the New Testament, and its emphasis is on disciplinary action. And so he is not going to sharply rebuke or harshly discipline older men. And this is, I would imagine, a pretty difficult area for Timothy to traverse, in that he's not supposed to ignore older men who may be in the wrong. It's not, do not rebuke them at all, or do not correct them at all. It's do not sharply do so. And so he's not supposed to ignore if anyone, is in the wrong. But he is supposed to be careful that he doesn't do it in a way that may be perceived as harsh. So even an older man may be in need of correction, but correcting him as you would a father means that the correction is done in a positive and loving way, and the goal is to restore fellowship. It's not done in a divisive way. And this is obviously said because he is directly addressing kind of each group, older men, older women, younger men, younger women, and how to ensure that instruction and discipline is done with love. Since chapter 1, verse 6, that's the goal of their instruction is love. But it's possible that Paul is emphasizing the leadership of the church, and you can take this what you will, but I thought this was interesting, in that when Paul is referring to older men here, he uses the same word that he just used in reference to eldership in chapter 4, verse 14. And that he's going to use later in the same chapter to talk about elders in chapter 5, verse 17, and about how to, when he talks about elders who rule well in chapter 5, verse 17, and elders who may need discipline in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. So it's likely that part of Paul's task in Ephesus is to strengthen the leadership. You've got this a bit of a struggling church kind of being infiltrated by false teaching, and the church seems to consist of at least mostly, or maybe some, immature Christians, not necessarily the leadership. But this could be why Paul gives Timothy a list of qualities that he's looking for in men to become elders and deacons. Like, hey, this is who you're looking for, but this is also the standard for the ones you have. And so this could be kind of Paul's part of Timothy's job. So all of these men could be older than Timothy. Well, they would be older than Timothy, which might be why Paul included that nobody looked down on his youth, chapter 4, verse 12, and that the elders have authorized his gift that he's used in Ephesus, chapter 4, verse 14. So regardless of whether or not Paul is emphasizing the church's leadership in this verse or not, or maybe he has that in mind as he writes it or not, the point is that though the older, more mature men in the congregation may be in need of correction at times, since nobody's perfect, right? Timothy is to be careful to ensure that the correction is done in a way that fulfills his goal. Chapter 1, verse 6, his goal is love. So likewise, he goes on, the younger men are to be corrected as brothers. So there's a difference in respect in how you see a father versus your brother, but your goal remains the same. With younger men, Timothy is to see them more as maybe siblings or peers. There's kind of a mutual upbuilding that happens when you are helping your brother. And so he wants them to see younger men as brothers, not ones who you are to abuse your own authority on them, but that you can uplift your wayward brother. And the same principle applies to older women as to fathers. So he kind of continues in this family framework, because we're in the household of God, right? And Paul expects Timothy to treat the older women with high esteem. And even the culture around them highly esteems mothers. So he tells Timothy, make sure that you are, if you need to correct older women or teach older women, that it is done as you would your own mother. And then younger women were to be treated similarly to brothers as mutual peers who are building one another up. And yet Paul adds with all purity at the end of it because he understands the danger that Timothy could be in because of sexual temptation. Paul discusses the young single widows and maybe their temptation. We'll get to this here in a minute. Their temptation because of sensual desires, chapter 5, verse 11, which kind of places Timothy, potentially in even more danger to succumb to his own temptation, right? Like this could be a difficult situation. And this is something that has kind of always been the case, so if you need to be aware of this. But with Timothy, we see it could be specific to his situation, but it's really a consistent all the way through. Paul is giving Timothy advice of be careful in those particular situations, that when you do teach or correct, that is done with all purity. Now, we get this discourse on widows, and it's the longest of all of the discussions that Paul has in 1 Timothy about a specific group. His discourse on widows is the longest one. And so we're going to get this treatment of widows, of how the church is to treat widows and care for widows. So Paul instructs Timothy on that, on how Ephesus is to care for them, but also the qualifications for if you're going to be solely supported by the church as a widow, who do you need to be? What are your qualifications? And I think it is definitely the most extensive discussion, but I think it's interesting because this is a model that I don't see anyone do. Like, I don't know of any congregation that has this model. Now, I think that we all care for widows, but how we do it is interesting. And so, Paul actually, I think Ephesus already has something set up, but Paul goes through some very specific, this is how it is to be done. And I think it's interesting, nonetheless, just to know what we can learn from this. I don't know if program is the right word. You might hear me say program a few times, for lack of a better word. But these qualifications and how it is to be done, I think we can learn a lot about it. But we certainly know that God He cares a lot about widows. He kind of considers himself the protector of widows. We see in Deuteronomy in a couple places how much He cares about that. And He ensures that they are always taken care of and that they receive justice. And in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17, doing justice involves taking care of widows. So the care for widows and the task of God's people to ensure that they are cared for is biblically consistent all the way through the Bible. From Old to New Testament, this is something that God's people are to ensure that they focus on and that widows are not neglected. In fact, we see in Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, that this was the reason that men were assigned with a specific church task outside of the eldership was we need someone to take care of these Hellenistic widows, and so we appoint certain specific men who fit these qualities to do that role. But why are widows in such need of care, especially in this time? Well, because especially in this time, they have no ability to care for themselves financially or potentially physically. And so Paul is prescribing a system for Timothy to adhere to in determining how to best care for widows. And so we're going to reevaluate maybe some of this as we go in regard to our context. But first thing, before getting into the text, is we need to talk about first century widows. And covering some of this context stuff is going to help us kind of move through the text a little bit faster. One is the whole, and you might not remember this because it was the first class, but early on we talked about this thing called the New Roman Woman, and all it essentially says is that there's this very countercultural idea floating around the Roman culture that says that women, instead of being married and having kids, they should basically try to accumulate as much wealth as possible. They might pay false teachers or philosophers to come in and try to teach them stuff in their homes. They throw extravagant parties. They're looking constantly for sexual partners, leading to many abortions, actually. And so they're very sexually promiscuous and greedy and prideful. That was the kind of movement that we're talking about among some women in the Roman culture. And it seemed to maybe particularly affect women in Ephesus. And so this kind of serves as maybe a helpful background for some of the qualifications that are coming up. But further, women somewhat found their identities from their husbands in their society. And so it was devastating to experience a divorce or death of a husband. Now, death of a husband without a dowry from the husband's family was especially problematic for the widow, because now she has no money to care for herself. So she would have to rely on her family to take care of her. Now, widows were generally cared for by their families, both in Judaism and in their Roman culture, as it should be in ours as well. And the government even had a program where if widows had no dowry and no family to care for them, then the government kind of gave them some money. I think it's called provincia is what I have on the screen. But it was the family's responsibility first to provide for its widows. Now, the church would also ensure that widows were not dishonored, that they were cared for. And early church writings show how much they really cared about that. That when they gave, some people record that when they gave, they gave and then someone immediately took it and they dispersed it to widows and orphans and wherever else it needs to go. But they specifically named widows in that. So it has always been a high priority. However, there were younger widows, and we'll get there in the text when we get there, who could kind of be caught up in this whole, maybe I want to live this other lifestyle kind of thing that we just talked about. And they're kind of abusing their widowed status for more money. It's like, yeah, I'll enroll in this church program, get some more money, but then I'm going to live how I want to. And that seems to be, at least, something that we can kind of guess based on culture and what's happening here in the text. So this, along with some questionable behavior, particularly regarding sexual ethics, creates quite the background for the system that Paul is about to discuss. Now, regardless of how much all of the historical and cultural information needs to be factored in here, Paul shows that he has an understanding of the situation of widows in Ephesus. He knows what's going on with the church, and that there's a burden on the church, and that we need to somehow relieve that burden, but also that widows need to still be cared for, but real widows. And so that's what Paul is about to get at. Verse 3. Honor widows who are widows indeed. And the word honor here, in this case, is not necessarily restricted to respect, but rather it's like respect them to the point that you will care for them. There is an action involved in the honor or respect that you show. Now the question is, and this is one that Paul is about to elaborate on a lot, is who are widows indeed, or real widows is maybe a different translation that you might have. And this is what Paul is about to help us define for the rest of the discussion. We know, of course, that a widow is someone whose husband has passed, but who are the widows that Paul says the church in Ephesus should be helping? Who are the real widows that we're discussing? So look with me. As I'm going to try on the screen, I'll write here's one and here's one. I think we're going to have 5 or 6 key qualifications or qualities here. Verse 4. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. So the first thing is they need to be without family. And we're going to see that more clearly in the second verse, but we kind of get that here. If they have family or grandchildren, children or grandchildren, then the children or grandchildren must first practice piety. Now, what does that mean? Now, Paul provides the family the opportunity to live out their religion, to put what they believe, their faith, into practice by caring for a widow. He immediately ties it to the fact that this is both an opportunity and an obligation for the family to care for the widow, the dependent widow. And this is a primary reason that the family should care for their own widows. It immediately connects to, or it directly connects to their faith, is what he's establishing early on. It's like they get the chance to first learn to practice their faith. Now, however, there's also this idea of like a return on investment, which I'm pretty sure is like ROI in the, thank you, I got a nod, in the money world. I was kind of worried that I was going to look at Ted and he's like, ROI, like, what is that? And then I was going to be, but anyways, I'm pretty sure it's a real thing. But regardless if ROI is real or not, that there's this idea of return on investment, which means that Paul is saying, like, you get the opportunity, and you're obligated, to care for this widow who has cared for you. And so now she gets the opportunity to, like, get a return on all of this time and effort that she's put in on you. And so in both instances, we get both opportunity and the obligation to do so. Next, verse 5. Now she is a widow indeed, or a real widow, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Okay, so we get that one. That first one is that she's been left alone. She's without family or grandchildren that is going to provide for her. But also, she's fixed her hope on God. She's devoted to God. And so she's one whose situation is desperate, to the point that her hope is fixed solely on God, and she trusts that God is going to provide. She's praying with entreaties and prayers night and day. It is a constant prayer for her, this level of hope that she has. And yet the disqualified widow, though she may not have family to take care of her, this is a woman who lives luxuriously. It's kind of the idea that you see this whole wanton pleasures. Wanton is not a word that we typically use very often, but it's a strong desire to live differently, to live luxuriously or maybe sensually, like with a sexual focus. And so this is a woman who's kind of characterized in chapter 2, verse 9. Remember the woman who's going to wear the fancy clothes and the gold in the hair and the pearl, all that kind of stuff. Like that. This is the kind of woman that we're kind of talking about here in chapter 5. And so this could describe her living as sexually immoral or selfishly or in an overabundance of indulgence. She's not one who's willing to share her wealth with the needy. This is a woman who really is not in need of the church's support at all. And this is other than the character that you see of, like, you probably don't want to support someone completely that is living this way. You also just get, if she's living luxuriously, she probably doesn't need the church's support. And so don't support her. She's not living as one who deserves it or needs it. So, verses 7 and 8. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So Paul once again encourages Timothy to prescribe or command and teach these things. However, who are the ones who are to be above reproach? At first glance, you may think it's the widows who are to be above reproach. However, I think it makes the most sense to be the families of the widows. This verse 8 especially, kind of parallels verse 4 to show that the families, namely the ones who are kind of running the household, though I'm not sure how clearly that distinction is made, and that it should be providing for those who are in their household, namely widows. So verse 4 is a much more positive command, but this verse frames it much more as an obligation that must be met if you're going to call yourself faithful. This is a grave issue, and this is why we kind of made that point. Like, it immediately connects to your faith. It's a grave issue as one who doesn't do this has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Well, why is he worse than an unbeliever? Well, first, even unbelievers would care for their widows typically. Like, this was a cultural, like, you care for your widows, the ones who are depending on you. But, yes. Okay. In verse 4? Well, okay, so she can still be a widow and have children, which is kind of what he's getting at, is that the family is the first one that is to care for them. But without going into too much detail, sometimes the King James does weird stuff with their words, partially because they wrote in like 1611, and so they had less scrolls than we had, and so some of their stuff's a little wonky. And so you kind of got to factor that in with some stuff like when you get the word nephews. Because I don't think most translations are going to have that, because I don't think that's what the word is. But so sometimes you just got to factor that. Same with the New King James. You just got to work that in. But that is a fair. I can see how you'd be confused about that. If yours said nephews, I would understand. But yeah, and so let's see. Where are we? Verse 8. Oh yeah, we're at the denying faith thing. If you deny your faith, then you're worse than an unbeliever. Why is that so? Okay, well, first, even unbelievers and even people in the culture are going to care for their widows. But secondly, and maybe most importantly, those who are unbelievers never profess Christianity, and yet those who consider themselves Christians are the ones who are essentially denying that name. By not caring for their widows, they're essentially saying, Paul is saying, yeah, I'm not a Christian. I don't have this faith because you're not showing it. You're not practicing it, right? That's what he gets at in verse 4. You have the opportunity to practice your faith, your religion. Well, now in verse 8, he's saying, and then you deny it if you don't do it. So it's an obligation of yours, if you are a Christian, to do such. So this is how serious God is about caring for our widows, especially within our immediate families. Now, verses 9 and 10 provide us a list of qualifications or qualities similar to the elders and deacons. Like there's some qualifications and there are some just qualities that they have of widows who can be put on, quote, the list. And so let's read this together. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. Now, there appears to be some kind of list already of widows who were being helped, and I would assume, because there's already a list, Paul might be going through this, because later on we're going to see that the goal is kind of, and I already talked about this, but the goal is kind of to relieve some of the burden that this list has caused, because there's so many widows on it. And so because of that, we can kind of assume, okay, some of these widows are abusing this list, and so Paul's kind of chopping down, these are the ones who are in real need, the real widows, and these are the ones you should be supporting in this way. And so he's going to narrow down. We got some people who are abusing the church's help, so instead he's going to narrow down to those who are in the most need rather than those who are kind of taking advantage of the church's giving. And so he starts, the first qualification is that she is not less than 60 years old. So this would have been beyond the typical marriageable age, you could say, especially because of shorter life expectancies back then than we have today. This would have been closer to the end of life by the time you're 60, and because of that, women might really need someone to take care of a lot of their physical needs by the time that you are above 60. And so in a small group of Christians, I don't know how big the church in Ephesus was, but in a smaller group of Christians, there may not be that many women who even fit this qualification so far, the ones we've discussed so far. But also that she was the wife of one man. Now that age and family situation, we've already narrowed it down a bit. We've already weeded out some of these women on the list. But Paul now begins to look at the life of the woman, the life that she has lived. She has been a one-man woman. Typically we say a one-woman man. But in this case, she's been a one-man woman. She's been faithful to her husband without any sexual immorality. She's got a reputation for good works. Now this is kind of the final category, I guess, for assessment for us, because it kind of encompasses all the rest that is to come. All the rest that he does, or that he says, is like all good works that this woman is known for. So notice how important the reputation of the Christian is. It was crucial. It was a crucial part of the qualities and qualifications for elders and deacons, and now it's a crucial part of the qualities of a widow who is to be on the list. So I thought that was interesting. There's actually a lot of similarities between the qualifications and qualities of elders and deacons and that of widows in regard to their faith, their fidelity towards their spouse, and how they've lived their life, their reputations. And that kind of tells you this is how Christians are to be. And if you are living this way, then you are qualified for these things. And so I thought that was interesting, the parallels that we'll get. And you'll see some as we go, but you've already seen some as well. Now, the phrase good works. here at the beginning, that she is known for her good works, in verse 10 at the beginning, is an interesting one. Because at first glance, it might call you back to chapter 2, verse 10. Remember where in chapter 2, verse 9, it's like they're adorning themselves with all this stuff and rich stuff. And then in verse 10, they say, now instead, adorn yourself with, they should adorn themselves with good works. So it might call you back to chapter 2, verse 10. However, the actual words that are used are actually the same as what we get in chapter 3, verse 1, which is the beginning of the list of elder qualifications. That's what we get here. And so Paul is beginning this list of they should be known for their good works. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, where it says the desire to be an elder is a noble work, something along those lines. What we're about to get is Paul is about to list all of these good works that women are to be known for, similar to how with the list of elders, he says this is a good work to be an elder, and this is what it entails, and kind of gives you the list. So I think that's cool. And we'll tie back to chapter 2, verse 10 here in a second. But what we get here is all of the things that pertains to this woman's reputation as a Christian woman. Well, the first thing is that she's brought up children, and this is referring to the children that she once had in her home. And that she needs to be a woman who honorably raised these children and performed the roles that are necessary in the home. She is known, her reputation is that she has brought up children, that she has shown hospitality to strangers. Now, this is similar to what we see of overseers or elders in chapter 3, verse 2, right? She's shown hospitality, and she's shown that this is an expectation this is an expectation for all Christians. And I think that that's what the whole elders and even real widows shows. This is for everybody, right? But she is one who must be known for how she cared for traveling believers. She extended the church's mission in that she's willing to have strangers in her home as a Christian. She has served the saints. She's washed the saints' feet. And so while Paul uses the specific act of foot washing, I think that probably most likely symbolizes kind of just serving the saints in general, in service and hospitality to those who are in the church. She has served those who are in distress. And though we can't be sure exactly what this refers to, like some specific situation or something, the general idea is that the widow, who Paul considers a real widow, is worthy of the church's assistance. This is one who is known for helping the poor and those who are in need, though now she is in that position. She's also devoted herself to every good work. Now, she pays attention or is devoted to every good work. Now, this phrase is the one from chapter 2, verse 10. And I only pull this aside because in chapter 2, this is a few weeks ago, we talked about this, so you probably don't remember, and that's okay. But when we got to chapter 3, verse 1, we said, well, this is different than chapter 2, verse 10. This is more of like a list of duties or of good works, that the elder is to be a part of. Well, chapter 2, verse 10 is like women are devoted to good works in that God's expectations for his people is more of a theological idea of like good works that we are designed to do. Remember Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, like we are created for good works. And so we're not going through like a specific list of duties, but when we use this phrase, it's like, this is what we're designed for, is good works. That's kind of the idea. And so he uses two different phrases in the same verse, is that her reputation should be known for good works, and we're going to give a list of it. Well, in the last one, it's that she has been devoted to good works, her purpose, the good works that she's been designed to do. This is what she's devoted to. And so what Paul's getting at is this woman, who is a real widow, has been devoted throughout her life, and she is known for this, for being devoted to the work that she was designed for, God's work, for good works. Verse 11. But refuse to put younger widows on the list. For when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. Now this is a really interesting verse, and it presents a really interesting issue. Though Paul has finished giving the qualities and the qualifications for real widows, and so we get this is who real widows are, he's going to continue elaborating on why some widows are disqualified. Like, why not include widows younger than 60? And so upon reading this passage, there's kind of some immediate questions that might come to mind. But I think the most important one is, should younger widows marry or not? Because Paul seems to condemn that here in verses 11 and 12. But then in verse 14, if you just look ahead a little bit in your Bible, he says, now what's the solution? You should get married and then bring up children. And so if you were just reading this straight through, you would think, I did think, what do you do with this? Like, what is Paul trying to get at? So let's talk about it. Younger widows. We're talking about women who are younger than 60, most likely referring to those in kind of their marriageable years. And it says that, he says, refuse to put younger widows on the list for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ. And this is to feel some sexual desires that would turn them against Christ. This is obviously in reference, I think, to some kind of sexual promiscuity that is tempting younger widows. And yet, this desire seems to be at odds with the result. When they feel these desires, they want to get married. Well, is that not a good thing? Hey, Paul, didn't you just say, verse 14, that's a good thing? Now, I'm sure that Paul and Timothy's audience, knew exactly what Paul was referring to and meant. Now, we're a bit in the dark on it. We're kind of a few years past. And so, what could he be talking about? Well, one piece of the puzzle comes in verse 12, in that they bring condemnation on themselves because they have set aside or rejected or refused their previous pledge. That's what the New American Standard says. Yours might say something different, and we'll talk about why in just a second. Now, what pledge are we talking about? So it's possible there was some kind of pledge of celibacy that widows were to take when they were receiving full church support. And instead of getting married, they were supposed to focus their efforts on the work of the church and to prayer. It's possible. Kind of what we see in verse 4, that's what these widows were devoted to. However, the word for pledge is actually the same word for faith, which kind of is odd because I don't often see this word as pledge or oath. It's more often just faith, especially when Paul uses it, especially in this letter. And so it's one that Paul has used frequently to talk about faith in this letter. And so Paul could just be talking about her faith in Christ as what she is rejecting or setting aside because of her sensual desires. Now we know for sure that that marriage is good, verse 14. There's one marriage that's good, verse 14. There's one marriage that's bad, verse 12, verse 11 and 12. And so why is that? What is Paul getting at? If Paul means that the widows, because of their sensual desires, have broken their vow, like this is a real vow or a pledge that they've made, then there's some pledge that they've taken, the contents of which we don't know, but we can assume it involves not remarrying. And then if they break that, and if they remarry, they bring condemnation on themselves because they broke their pledge. Now, what I think is more likely is this option, which is if Paul means that the widows are rejecting or refusing their faith by remarrying, it could very well be a result of maybe who they're choosing to marry. Think about it. If they're out living sexually promiscuous lives because of their sensual desires, they're probably not doing this with other Christians. They're probably partaking in such activities with unbelievers. So it makes sense that eventually they would find a guy in this world of unbelievers that she might want to marry. And that would contradict what Paul's already said in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 39, that widows do not need to marry unbelievers, especially because the wife is going to adopt the religion of her husband. So she would then be rejecting her first or primary, whatever yours may say, her first or primary faith for her sensual desires against Christ. Does that make sense? Now, I think that maybe makes more sense in the flow of it. Maybe there was a pledge or something or vow that we just don't know. It's totally possible. Verse 13. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. So we got this worst case scenario right before this, where they're marrying unbelievers, and now we've got younger widows who are partaking in gossip from house to house. If you thought we were getting rid of gossip for a week, 3 weeks running, we're talking about it. It appears that because they've been benefiting from church support, some younger widows have nothing to do. And so now they're going from house to house wherever they're comfortable. They've got no household responsibilities of their own, and they're gossiping. And so I think it's interesting, something I learned in this study is that women kind of had their own like honor and shame system. And part of that was you keep confidence. Like when someone says something to you, you keep the confidence. And so there could kind of be this whole, what Paul might be addressing here is, like there could be your own little power within the whole, like women in the households. Like other than the fact that they have power within their household. But you get all these women who are all keeping confidence, all having the same idea. This could be a dangerous thing. You pair that with the false teaching you've got running around and these cultural ideas that are popping up. And what Paul is saying is this is dangerous to the stability of the church. When you've got women who say that they are Christians and yet they are going from house, they're benefiting completely, solely from the church, and yet they're going from house to house gossiping. And they're busybodies. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 11 kind of talks about what a busybody is, and it's that you've got no business of your own, and so you're discussing everybody else's. And that seems to be what's happening here. And what they're saying are things not proper to mention, and this is kind of the nature of gossip. And so it could just be referring to things that they're talking about, but it could also be false teachings and these cultural ideas. So, we're not sure. Here's a solution. I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. So we've already seen a lot of this idea of getting married. This directly opposes. Remember the false teaching that said in chapter 4, verse 3 that they should abstain from marriage? Well, Paul's getting rid of that, and he says, no, I want you, actually, if you're a younger widow, to get married and then have some household responsibilities. And by doing that, you're not going to be creating a bad name for yourself and the church. You're not going to give Satan the opportunity, which is what we see here. Some have already turned to Satan. You're not going to give him the opportunity to grab you or to give a bad name to the church. But instead, you're going to bring a good name to yourself and the church. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, but may assist those who are widows indeed. What this verse is saying is, practically, it's most likely going to be the woman who is caring for the widow. And so if he particularly calls out widows, and says if you have a dependent widow, women. He particularly calls out women. And he says if you have a widow who's dependent on you, then you need to be caring for that widow so that the church is not burdened. That is your responsibility. Okay, sorry we ran through the end there, just like last week. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I'll be on.